Hi everyone. Recently I've been playing with creating Minecraft renders in Blender just as a fun experiment. Now I know a lot of people have done stuff like this before, but I wanted to have a go at it to see what the process was like of taking a world from Minecraft and then importing it into Blender. Here are some of the renders that I've come up with. You can see how I've added some extra subtle details and lighting. This started off as me jumping into the game and having fun in a creative world. For anyone that hasn't played the game before, this is basically where you can place down any type of block with very few limitations. Firstly, for some requirements, if you wanted to do this yourself, you obviously need Minecraft, the Java version. Then I used two different tools for importing a world from the game into Blender. The first was an add-on called MCPrep, and the second was a Java tool called JMC2Object. MCPrep is a multi-purpose toolkit for making all kinds of Minecraft-related things in Blender. It will help with the importing process and let you spawn in different kinds of characters. JMC2Obj, or Object, is a tool for actually reading the game world files and exporting them into a usable format, typically a .obj file. MCPrep can use either this or Mindways for the export, but I prefer the first. I didn't really know what kind of environment I wanted to make, but when I play Minecraft, I typically end up building some kind of temple, palace, or castle, so that's kind of what I was aiming for. I had no plan, so everything was improvised, like most of my work anyway. I found a mountainous area that overlooked an area of low-lying land with a distant forest, and I thought this looked quite scenic, so I started building. I didn't record the entire process, it took quite a long time to do and I didn't want to burn out my hard drive, but you can see some of the time-lapse happening now. I wanted to make sure that what I was building would allow for interesting renders to be taken from multiple different angles. So as I was putting it together, I would fly around and make a mental note of all the places I wanted to put a camera once it was finally imported into Blender. Since I knew I wanted different angles, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted the environment to look like in the end, I made sure that there were multiple levels of verticality and of course some symmetrical elements, because I find when it comes to environmental scenes, it's easier to compose something around multiple different objects instead of just one, because with multiple things to focus on, you can give a good sense of scale and distance. In Minecraft, there are different biomes that define the look of the generated environment. I thought it was quite convenient that I ended up in what's called the Badlands biome, because it had this nice variety of layered colors around the mountains and cliffs, which I thought made the scene much more interesting. Of course, when you finally import the world into Blender and start setting up all the materials, everything is available to be modified, so you can replace the textures of any type of block with whatever you like. Once I felt like I had a scene that was interesting enough to work with, I could begin the process of bringing it into Blender. Using MCPrep, I could launch JMC2Obj, which would start the separate Java application. This tool is pretty handy because it lets you choose from the available worlds on your machine, and then you can click and drag a selection area on the map below. There are lots of parameters for importing the data in whatever way you like. You can choose the lower and upper, or floor and ceiling values as they call it, to get only the slice of the world that you need. It's a very good idea raising the floor value in this case, because if we're only getting renders from the surface of the world, then there's no need to import all the cave networks below. That will just slow down Blender and it will be much more tedious to clean up. Once you have your selection, you can press the export button, which will bring up all the parameters for creating the exported file. Take note that this is also where you can export all of Minecraft's textures, so if you want to unpack them all for use in Blender, then you can do that here. You can choose whether to keep blocks as separate objects or join them all together. I highly suggest joining them together for optimization purposes. I also recommend making sure that create a separate object for each material is also enabled, as this will make it much easier to assign all the different materials to the different types of blocks. Then you can press export and choose a place to save the output. Back in MCPrep, you can press OBJ world import and then select the file you just exported. The selected area of your Minecraft world will now appear in the Blender scene, and this is one of the ways you can start making Minecraft art with Blender. The world is very bare bones to start with, there's not much going on with shading. Everything is pink when rendering because each of the generated materials are pointing to textures that Blender can't find. But at this point in the process, this is where we can start adding some customizability to everything. Now I personally took the approach of selecting every separated block type object, going into the shader nodes, and then pointing the image texture inputs to the appropriate file, which was exported from JMC2Obj earlier. Then to make sure the textures would actually look pixelated, I set the interpolation type to closest on the image texture node. This gives the pixels that sharp look, which prevents them from being unnecessarily blurry. Now I like having some light reactive height on the surface, so I plugged the same textures for a bump node, which was then passed on to the normal input of a principled BSDF shader. It feels a bit like cheating doing it this way, since we only typically want grayscale values when passing height values for a bump, but it looks interesting, so I don't really care. For objects with transparent areas like leaves and torches, the alpha value of the texture also needs to be passed to the alpha input of the principled shader. One note to make about transparency when using the Cycles rendering engine in Blender is that since it's a path-traced engine, we need to make sure that the transparency passes in the render settings is set to a high enough value to let the rays pass through them. Exactly what value to use will depend on your scene and how much you want to optimize, so it's worth doing some experimentation. Skipping ahead, I placed cameras at all the positions I made mental notes to do so during the building phase. From here, I started adding extra details, only subtle things like a few decorative elements and sources of lighting. I like using emissive material lighting in cycles, so I used a series of emissive strips around various areas to flood parts of the scene with light and color. For the sake of increasing the rendering speed, I separated the objects and light sources used from different render perspectives into different collections, so it would be easy to enable and disable them as required, since there's no point leaving them on if they're not really going to be seen from a different render perspective. Considering I've just done a video about human generation in Blender, I was also curious to see what it would look like having a much more realistic character in a Minecraft setting. Honestly, it looks a bit weird, but I don't know what I was expecting. I didn't like it, so I put the traditional Steve character in there as a replacement. Again, with the MC Prep add-on, this was surprisingly simple to do. They have a panel in the add-on interface called Spawner, and in here you can load in a character model. By importing the simple player option, the Steve character will be brought into the scene, and it's already been textured and rigged, making it ready for posing and animation. For fun, I threw in a few extra details, like a bit of personal branding, and then I started to put together some renders. This was surprisingly intensive for cycles to do, although that's probably mostly due to the heavy use of normal details and emissive lighting. But using Eevee, the real-time rendering engine for Blender, is also a viable option if you wanted much faster rendering capabilities for the trade-off of limitations with lighting and shading. But it's not like you need complex lighting for a Minecraft scene anyway. I also found that cycles denoising was quite appropriate for use in these renders because they are ultimately stylized. And since we're not going for realism, any tiny imperfections on the surface of textures caused by denoising won't really matter that much. In the end, I ended up with this collection of nice looking renders. Again, this project was more about experimentation and having fun rather than doing something serious. I wanted to see what the process was like of bringing content from a Minecraft world into Blender, and what kinds of tools were available to help people do that. Overall, I'm quite happy with how smooth the process was, so hopefully you found this interesting, but this is where I'm going to leave it for now. But before we close this up, I just want to make a note for my dedicated viewers that future episodes of the Hulkcast podcast will be uploaded to a brand new channel. So if you've been wondering where that content was, then you can head over there now. This is purely discussion content about all kinds of subjects, especially creativity, and it's something you can listen to while you work. So thanks for watching the video everyone, stay safe, stay creative, and I'll see you next time.